the Department of History, Kemal Karpat Center, and also the Center for East Asian Studies and the Center for Legal Studies, because I know that all of you got together to make my visit possible. So this was really, truly appreciated. I tell you, the 2 days that I've been here, you know, I feel so enthusiastic and really kind of relaxed and in a sort of good state of mind. Things back home are not so inspirational at the moment, but that's okay. That happens in life, as you know. Truly, thank you so much for making all of this possible. I really appreciate it. And I'm very glad that my student, you know, Emir is studying here. This was, I told Louise, I mean, you were targeted, I said, you know, like I wanted to make sure that he goes to fine hands, and I thought that this campus would be the best in terms of his graduate education. Without much ado, let me plunge into my topic. I called it twilight diplomacy. It's a word that I coined to describe Ottoman-Japanese relations in the 19th century. It's twilight because it's not official. It's not secret. It's government to government. So therefore, you know, it's diplomacy, except that there is no official treaty or record of it. You know, you have to decipher it through documents, memoirs, and you know, other kinds of historical information. And when you put the pieces together, you see that yes, they're practicing diplomacy. It's just informal, and they're using transnational contacts to do that.
Do slideshow?
No, I prefer it this way. I prefer it this way. And I also, my second, I guess, aligned topic is the Japanese mirror of the Ottoman-Turkish world, because that diplomacy generated actually this Japanese understanding of what this world is all about. And that has survived, it's remarkably, even to this date, of course, with some changes. And I'm going to use the source of Yamada Torajiro, who was the first Japanese resident of Istanbul. He was a merchant, you know, businessman. He made good money. He lived close to about 15 years in Istanbul. He learned vernacular Turkish. He also knew French and some English. So, you know, he lived in this late turn of the century cosmopolitan Istanbul, maybe the peak of its cosmopolitanism in terms of both cultural as well as economic contacts with the world nearby and far away. And he wrote a book when he returned back of his impressions. It's not a travelogue. It's what we call in Turkey the foreigner's, you know, memoir, impressions. What is this world all about? Who are these people? And maybe a take on this quote unquote exotic culture, you know. And it's called Toruko Gakan. I've translated it as Illustrated Observations of Turkey because every page is beautifully illustrated. That's also, you know, an aspect of the book that I will briefly discuss. And this is the first book that a Japanese person wrote about the Turkish world. And in that sense, it has a kind of, you know, maybe a pioneer type of role as a text. It's the first book that the Japanese would read. They want to know about, oh, what is this country, Turkey, all about? You know, this would be the first book that they would have to read. There are some other works, but they are usually just travel accounts, you know. Somebody came, stayed a week, and then in his diary or in his or her, you know, travelogue wrote about, oh, my impressions of Istanbul, my impressions of, you know, the Balkans, the Near East, and so on. So you get a couple of pages, you know. But this one is not so. I mean, it's a book which is around 200 pages itself, and it's all about what he thinks. You know, his ideas, his impressions. So that's my source. But before I get into my source, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a brief introduction in crusty diplomatic terms, because in the end of the day, this year is the, you know, 100th year centenary of Turkish-Japanese relations, and that needs to be understood so that you can understand the background to it. You know, why this year, what happened this year. And it's very much based on an international treaty. It's based on the Lausanne Treaty of 1923, which is the legal foundation of the Republic of Turkey. It's being called Turkey now since 2022. I'm going to use the word Turkey because it comes more natural to me. So diplomatic relations between Japan and Turkey began when Japan signed the Lausanne Treaty in 1923 as one of the allies. It was an ally of Great Britain, so Japan was technically a victor in the First World War. We have to remember that. The Lausanne replaced the previous 1920 Treaty of Sèvres, which was the base for the European occupation of Ottoman territories in Anatolia, Syria and Iraq, Lebanon and Palestine, and the occupation of the Ottoman capital, Istanbul. The Lausanne basically kind of snatched Anatolia out of that and said, you can have Iraq and Syria. I can't do anything about it anyway. But they snatched Anatolia out of this, occupation reality. Between 1919 and 1923, the Turkish nationalists of the Ankara government had defied the Serbs and had waged war under the leadership of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, you know that probably, against the terms of the occupation power. So it was a treaty won out of war. But it established peace among the Allies and the Ankara government, and it ended the Ottoman Empire formally. The Turkish side in that treaty gained equal footing with the Western powers in terms of international law. Another second important point here, by abolishing the capitulations, or as is popularly known, the extraterritoriality article, and related articles such as mandatory tariffs and all of that pertains to the unequal treaties of the 19th century that everybody's familiar with. Having abolished extraterritoriality, upon Lausanne's full ratification in August the 6th, 2024 in Paris, now Japan and Turkey were free to have a treaty relationship of mutual reciprocity. They could treat each other as equals in terms of international law in 1924. They opened up embassies and signed a treaty of trade and commerce in 1935. So I'm sure that this bit of information sounds a little contradictory to you, but because you say, but what you were talking about the 19th century, this merchant, this and that, twilight diplomacy, so what's going on here? So late that everything becomes legal now because it's based on an international treaty derived of the European understanding of international law, of course, as we know, which became global in the 19th and 20th century. So let me briefly also provide for you my evaluation of, well, what began in the 19th century and then how did it kind of continue after the 1924, ratification of the Lausanne, signing of a trade and commercial treaty and all of that. It's an interesting story. I've been thinking about Turkish-Japanese relations for some time because I've had to. This is the year, people ask me questions, so at least I have to sound a little bit informed, as having understood what was going on. And it's a very interesting type of international relations because it's not as maybe bombastic as, US-Japan relations, US-China relations, covering up the pages of The Economist or, New York Times or something. It's very discreet. It's one of those international relations which operates along, shall we say, a corridor of discretion. Because it's based, by and large, on the historical pattern that emerged in the 19th century from the twilight diplomacy background, and it has kind of carried into official relations as well. And I call it a trust network in international relations. I'm picking it up from Charles Tilly, Trust and a network of people who share the same language about each other in both countries. These could be diplomats, they could be army officers, they could be the man in the street, the woman in the street, intellectuals, whatever. They share a certain trust network with each other. In other words, they sort of collaborate, they have a sense of, solidarity, of bonding, whatever. I know it all sounds very romantic to you because that's exactly what the language is. It's romance for realpolitik. Well, sometimes you have contrasts in the political world. I mean, you don't expect romance in politics because, countries, they strive for their national interest, whether you like it or not. They're ambitious. They've got plans. They're hitting hard. But then, in this occasion, both sides are using romance, okay? So it's a trust network, I would say. And I'm going to explain what I mean by this, and there are different patterns that emerged from the twilight diplomacy of the 19th century. I'm going to talk about the patterns now. 3 patterns. The first 2 are collaborative. The third one is conflictual. And as long as the first 2 are, not in conflict with pattern 3, this trust network works. Okay? So let's look at the 3 patterns. First pattern, Japanese-Turkish relations based on the Gaimusho. What the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs thinks, its vision of Japan's position in European international law and Japan's role in global diplomacy, government to government. They did it informally in the 19th century. They're going to do it formally after 1924. Now, the second pattern that emerges is this romance, this language of romance, which, despite government-to-government relations, is also reality. People are motivated by it. They make their contacts. They plan according to it, if you will. And so, this is Japanese and Turkish, what I call Asianist cosmopolitanism. Mutual discourse of romantic imagination, based on themes of shared roots, that somewhere in Central Asia we were brothers, weren't we? It sounds really fantastic when you hear 2 businessmen talking to each other like this. Let's do this, investment in Central Asia because we're brothers from Central Asia anyway. And you say, what? You're talking about a millennia-old origins, for a business venture, but that's the language they will use, before signing the contract. We were brothers in Central Asia anyway, that sort of thing. And or similar global objectives that have influenced individuals, networks in Japan and Turkey to the state. And I think it needs to be studied. I've encountered it quite often, frequently. And I certainly am familiar with the material, but this sort of like realpolitik, but using this language of totally emotive, kind of rapprochement. The Japanese and Turks, they're kindred brothers or something like that, and that has a long history. It goes back to the 19th century. Now, those 2 components, patterns, they're okay. Because government to government, realpolitik, frequently will use this language to frame itself, to sort of embellish, to create the collaboration, the cooperation. But then there's a third Japanese pattern of Turkish-Japanese relations, and this one can create conflict between the 2. Japanese intelligence and military interest. In the Turkish world, meaning Turkey and beyond Turkey, not just Turkey today, and the land that it is, as a buffer against Russia. Sound familiar? This is what the British have been thinking for a couple of centuries. But also as a buffer against the Western powers. So this is new, this is Japanese. Japan's imperial strategy of entry into the larger global Muslim and or Turkic world in Eurasia, challenging the Western powers. So this is sort of like where Turkey becomes important because it has the, shall we say, human, maybe power that can be used for access to other worlds, to the Near East, to Central Asia, to, the Caucasus or something like that. So that's the Japanese vision. Now, this third pattern is Pan-Asianism political. It's parallel but different than Pan-Asianism or Asianism cosmopolitan. I think we have to make a distinction there, that they don't all function the same. A generation ago when people heard Pan-Asianism, they said, what are you talking about, aggression, expansionism, imperialism, and so on. Yes, that's true. That's how it ended up. We know that in the Second World War. But I think Pan-Asianism is not just one type of Pan-Asianism. You also have Asian cosmopolitanism, which is not necessarily envisioning some kind of aggressive expansionism, but a camaraderie, a bonding. Sometimes I call it the Bandung syndrome, sort of like us who sort of can bond and we should, help each other because there are these global powers, and that sort of thing, So, to get back to my trust network, well, with the caveat that 1 and 2, do not or did not conflict with 3. So, government to government and Asianist, cosmopolitanism. This is non-governmental, circles of people, so on and so forth. These two patterns are okay with each other, but sometimes the Japanese military, strategic, ambitions conflict. And that's where, the sort of divergence starts in Turkish-Japanese relations. So let's look at the trust network moments. I mean, how did it operate? How did it, sort of emerge? One, it began with the Ottoman frigate Ertuğrul's shipwreck on September the 16th, 1890 in Kushimoto, Wakayama, on its return voyage after completing a goodwill visit to Emperor Meiji, which created truly wide sympathy in Japan. The Japanese were shocked that this foreign ship carrying around 650 officers, crew, they, encountered a typhoon. Practically all of them, except 69 individuals, drowned, and their bodies had to be collected. The survivors had to be medically treated. There were these, extraordinary sort of like public movements. Let's help the Turks. Let's help them. It was also, a colleague of mine also wrote about this and said that maybe it was also the occasion that the Meiji wanted to show that they are, modern by helping foreigners in need. So even the Empress, for example, she had some undergarments, sewn for the survivors. So everybody is collecting money, doing this, very 19th century type, sort of Good Samaritan kind of reaction. And perhaps the Japanese sort of like felt this was the way they could show their internationalism, their, sort of change in the Meiji period, not as a secluded, isolated people, but they're helping people in need. Remember, in the Tokugawa period, you couldn't really guarantee that the Tokugawa authorities are going to rescue you if you had a shipwreck. So this one is kind of like, we prove that we can, sort of thing. So that created a narrative, both in Japan. This was an accident, created a narrative, both in Japan and in the Turkish world. The Japanese battleships, Kongo and Hiei, brought back the 69 survivors with great pompous kind of pride. We have 2 battleships now, and they're sailing into Istanbul harbor. Again, a little bit show of force there, a little bit show of, we're modern, we have a navy, type of, act. The tragedy narrative, therefore, has been, to this date, romantic discourse of unfailing friendship that was born out of a tragedy. You could make an Italian opera out of it, truly. In fact, an almost Italian opera type of a film was made. A couple of years ago, it had some showing in Japan. It didn't really reach the limelight, but lots of money. Japanese companies really poured out a tremendous amount of money. It's a Hollywood type of a film, They recruited actually very good, Japanese actors and actresses and Turkish actors and actresses. So, I mean, it's an entertaining kind of, sort of like an adventure type of, movie. But, everybody is supposed to be in tears in the end. I mean, all these people are dying and, the shipwreck and everything, but the rescue operation, a very sort of like, exaggerated maybe narrative. It's called Kainan, which means naval disaster, that it was. Now, who invested in Kainan? The Japanese companies did. Mitsubishi Mitsui and all of them, The Turkish government did. I even went to the gala opening and I'm thinking, why is the Turkish government investing in all of this? And it sort of is like this film is, you might say, a kind of soft power that generates out of this romantic, discourse that I'm talking to you about. And of course, the end deal is business, inviting Japanese capital. And about that time, Japanese capital was invited for the underwater tunnel, which now connects Asia to Europe. You can go under the, Bosphorus, cross in about 10, 15 minutes, and so on. So business, interest, and this language, and this, sort of aura. Meiji and Japanese and the Ottoman authorities were unable to sign a treaty of trade after the disaster because of their disagreement over extraterritoriality. The Japanese, well, it's kind of Guy Musho's narrow thinking, I guess, but 19th century we're talking about, and Japan is going to defeat China, remember, in 1894, and get extraterritoriality privileges from China. They're grooming themselves to be an empire. They want to be exactly like the Western powers. So in Istanbul, they made the mistake of telling the Turks, we want extraterritoriality. In the late date of 1894, you can imagine how the Ottoman bureaucrats must have, sort of like made jokes, behind their scene. But anyway, they always got a polite no. This was repeated. It's amazing. It's a mantra. The Japanese, they want a treaty. And then the Istanbul people say, well, we love you anyway, Why do you need a treaty? This was, in fact, one of the answers saying, treaties are only for Europeans. You are part of us. You don't need a treaty. You're a family. This is typical Turkish diplomatic response at the time. Note what I mean using that bonding language. Treaty? Oh, it's only for those, the Europeans that you and I, we sort of don't like that much all the time. So, we sign treaties with them, but you're family. You don't need a treaty. Why should you have a treaty? So the Japanese were always turned down, and it ended up, finally, they got the message. So both sides started using a transnational network because both sides, actually, they want a relationship. This is the important point. They want to sort of have close relations, but how are you going to do that? International law doesn't allow you to do it, okay? So how can you get around it? Well, one has to give credit to the Ottoman bureaucrats because they're very inventive sometimes, bureaucrats, They invented a concept. Actually, it's an old concept. They said, no problem. We'll have the Japanese under royal protection of the Sultan, using the palace's privilege of extending protection to individuals. Kings can invite people into their, palace and protect them. They could even sometimes even live in the palace, It's an old, early modern, kingly type of, lifestyle. They can invite foreigners, they can stay 10 years, 15 years sometimes in a palace, writing their books and entertaining the sovereign, at dinner table or something. So the Japanese who were living in Istanbul, Yamada is one of them, they got these official, very formally written letters from the government saying, well, you're under the Sultan's protection. Therefore, you just show this letter to the Chamber of Commerce, to any of the police or anybody when you're traveling, and that's your passport. That's it. You're legal. You don't need a treaty. We're protecting you. It's called the concept of himaye, which means, sort of like royal largesse, I protect you because I think you're a good, sort of subject, and I like conversation with you, or I like your art, or whatever. That's what kings do. Hence, throughout these years, the Japanese had a legal status. They were under the palace's protection, which solved the problem of having to have a treaty. You don't need a treaty. And therefore, everything functioned as if they had one. The Japanese served as unofficial consul generals. They're the ones who made appointments. They're the ones who acted as, guides, translators, interpreters, taking care of money business. If a Japanese person needed to send some money someplace, use a bank account, whatever consul generals do, even today. This is what they did, even though they're not diplomats. So they are acting as a transnational. The Japanese store, Nakamura Shoten, that's the name of the store, of Yamada and the other Japanese in downtown Istanbul, between the years 1892 and 1914, all those years, served as the source of information about Japan. So, it goes two ways. The Japanese who come, they want to find out about the Near East, the Balkans, the Turkish world, Russia. They usually would come to the store, get some information, some contacts, make appointments, go and see these people, get their business done. But also for the Turkish side, it was also the source of information about what's going on in Japan. For example, the Sultan kept, contacting the store and getting Yamada over to the palace to find out about the 1904 war. What is actually happening in the battlefield? Are you winning? Are you losing? Give me the latest news. So, monitoring the Russo-Japanese War through audiences with Yamada. Second, around the turn of the century, I wouldn't be surprised if one day it turns out that this was some sort of discreet propaganda on part of the Japanese army. But suddenly, the press in the Near East was full of stories that, the Mikado converted to Islam. I mean, it was not just in the Istanbul papers, but all over. Egyptian papers, even European press. Well, we heard the rumors that somehow Emperor Meiji, he converted to Islam. This kind of totally fictitious, sort of story, but it was popular. So the Sultan called up the store to, interrogate them about saying, is there any truth about this? Or is this just some kind of fictitious story that my people are telling me? And then, of course, the Japanese in the store said, no, Your Highness, I mean, this is not true, but some papers are writing about this, and so on and so forth. So to check information, that's what the store was used for. When we go further, I caught another one of those, sort of discrete communications and collaborations, actually in the years right after World War I. When the victorious allies, Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, occupied Istanbul, after the First World War between 1919 and 1923. The Japanese High Commissioner, Minister Uchida Sadatsuchi is his name, he's a diplomat. Immediately, the moment he arrived, now he is there as an ally of Britain, and he's a high commissioner serving in the occupation of the city, right? The minute he arrives, he finds out whom he can contact to secretly, in a clandestine manner, communicate with the Ankara rebels. So he starts a conversation with the Ankara government, which is technically London's enemy, okay? Because they're waging war. They're denying the Treaty of Sèvres. So Uchida sends messages back and forth, sort of like offering his services. You know, maybe I can negotiate on your behalf with the British to end this war in your favor. And then even more interestingly, when he's contacting the Ankara Turkish nationalist, government, even the British High Commissioner, his name is Horace Rumbold, he gets wind of this and he says, well, why don't you ask the Ankara rebels whether they can stop the Khilafat movement in India? Isn't that an interesting message? You know, the Khilafat movement of both Gandhi and the Shaukat brothers, it was actually a sort of, movement against British, colonial authorities and demanding independence, but it was sort of couched in terms of why are you occupying the imperial capital of the Caliph, the Ottoman Sultan? You shouldn't have done that sort of thing. But they were creating a tremendous mass movement in India. So the British High Commissioner is asking the Japanese not to contact the Istanbul government that represents the empire, but the rebels. Send a message to the rebels. Can they do anything about it? So messages start going back and forth, and even it extends to the level of, the Ankara government says, well, if you get out of these territories that you've occupied and if you kick the Greeks out of West Anatolia, maybe we can make a deal, And on the British side, they respond, I felt sorry for the Greeks when I read this in a telegram. Oh, kicking out the Greeks from Anatolia, no problem. But we don't want to give up our territories that we've occupied in Thrace at the moment. So the Greeks were abandoned, actually, in 1920. And they had to fight 3 more years, unnecessarily, because Britain had just dumped them, basically, at that point in time, which is what we discovered from these conversations. After the end of the Second World War, Turkey declared war against Germany and Japan. And while Germans were interned in a camp far away in the hinterland, living under very difficult conditions, the Japanese were interned in their own consulate. And the next day they were allowed to take walks out in downtown Istanbul. They were free to do whatever they wanted. So this is what I mean about, treating the Japanese kind of specially in this relationship. And today it is very well known that Turkish and Japanese diplomats always contact each other immediately when they are, appointed to an international organization like the United Nations or UNESCO. They immediately call each other up and say, hey, what do you want? What do I want? And let's do it together. So this is a kind of sort of very predictable practice, if you will. There are moments of crisis that I'm not going to get into in detail, but there was once an occasion, for example, in 1933, when the Japanese Pan-Asianist army officers, a clique of them, contacted an exiled former prince of the Ottoman dynasty living in Syria and invited him to come to Japan, 1933, remember? Right after Manchukuo. And the plan here was, let's have another puppet regime in Xinjiang, because the East Turkestani Uyghurs were in rebellion. The Japanese were helping them indirectly. And the plan is we have Puyi in Manchukuo. Let's have Abdul Kerim in Urumqi. So all of that zone will be pro-Japanese and under our control. Against whom? The Soviet Union. So one big block there. That didn't work. The Turkish embassy immediately intervened. The Uyghur were not doing too well in the battlefield anyway, and they protested, threatening that this is going to be the end of our trust relationship if you pursue this plot. So the poor prince was told to leave back, Japan, and he returned back to Syria in 1 year. In other words, there are moments like this. This is military. This is the third pattern, where the military pattern interferes. And it's an objective which is against the interest, at least of the Turkish side. And therefore, immediately that will sort of like sever the, collaborative frame of their relationship. Japanese Muslim agents, for example, we see quite common in the 20th century, the format of training Japanese agents working for the military. Basically infiltrate into Muslim, communities in China, in Southeast Asia, and some of them have tried to get into Turkey, but always, they were sort of like kicked out and not allowed to cross the frontier. So that's where goodwill relations didn't work that much. So the trust network, all in all, it's worked most of the time, except for these military interventions whenever they happened, has served both sides, especially in times of crisis, making use of the Asian camaraderie language in negotiations. For example, on March 15th in 1985, the Turkish Prime Minister Turgut Özal sent a private Turkish Airlines airplane into the war zone over Iran to rescue 215 Japanese citizens who were helplessly stuck in Tehran when Saddam Hussein started bombing and sending missiles. So they were flown back to Istanbul, and it was part of this, it was a risky kind of operation. Nobody dared go into the war zone, and all the pilots volunteered, all of them said, we're going to save the Japanese. The Turkish passengers were asked to give up their seats, so they would have to wait for another, rescue. And the Japanese were, flown out into Istanbul. Özal did get his Japanese consortium to build the second Bosphorus Bridge that year. So, you can see that there's also sort of like immediate interest linked with all of this. Recently, Japanese diplomats have kept inviting Turkey to connect with the free and open Indo-Pacific policy, the rule of law and democracy nations, especially the late Prime Minister Abe Shinzo was very active there. He wanted Turkey in to his, free and open Indo-Pacific strategy. So that's kind of like their, approach to the authorities in Ankara. The Turkish Foreign Ministry, in step with this invitation, but on different terms, began the Asia Anew initiative, cooperating with Japan on its own terms. But at the same time, I think that should be also noteworthy. Japan and Turkey chose to declare Russia as an aggressor together. They didn't want to declare Russia as an aggressor separately, but they wanted to show themselves sort of like a kind of in unison to the global press. And that was also, I think, a staged, act. So to summarize, and then I'm going to, move into Yamada and his book. Recently, the NHK, which is, as you know, the BBC of Japan, a member of the NHK responsible for filming a documentary about Turkey, he commented that the two countries needed each other as a Daisangkyoku, a third pole, arena of communication and collaboration in a global environment dominated by others, namely China and the United States. Therefore, Turkey and Japan, they should keep these channels of cooperation parallel but distinct, autonomous of the United States on one side and China on the other side. And that's, I think, a term which captures what the Japanese want out of this relationship. It's the Japanese perspective of this trust relationship, so to speak. So why is our book important? Our book is important because it is the Japanese mirror of the Ottoman Turkish world as a source for the patterns number 1 and number 2. You can read it in the book, and you can see the emergence of this, trust, mutuality, and the Asian cosmopolitan language linked with it, So it's a source for discussing the Japanese imagination of their mirror of the Ottoman Turkish world as Asianist cosmopolitanism. Yamada Torajiro himself, he includes the Turkish world that he's seeing. He says it's part of us. It's part of us, Asia, but please do not mistake, this is not part of Asia of Pan-Asianism politics. It's part of Asia because of its culture, because of its lifestyle, because of its emotive human relations, kind of like difficult to sort of catch, in other words, materially, but something spiritual, something which is, sort of like imaginative and inspirational. And this is the book itself. This is what the original looks like, one published in 1911. And then this one is the annotated Turkish translation that I came up with in 2021. I tell you, it took me 10 years to do it. I mean, going through all that kanbun and kanji, I was going out of my mind, I can tell you. But it was challenging, and it certainly taught me a lot, I should say. So let me start first by talking about the individual who created this language, because I think his personality and his social background is important, why Asian cosmopolitanism is preferred in interpreting, the Turkish world. Yamada's connection to Turkey, to me, represents the adaptation of the losers of the Tokugawa high elite to the new Japan of the Meiji Restoration elite, clique of the winners. His father was a karo, a very high-ranking, samurai of Numata domain that was Fudai, which means very loyal to the Tokugawa shogunate. His karo ancestors were always advisors in Edo. In other words, he is the son of a family that was once very high-ranking in the ancien regime. And if you know anything about Japanese politics of the Meiji period, you'd know that he's never going to make it at the top political inner circle of the Meiji, ruling elite. He's not Satsuma, he's not Choshu. Forget about him becoming an officer of high rank, But even in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or any other ministry, Numata domain boy, and it's not even a big domain, it's sort of like the family had to fend for themselves. In other words, they had to remake themselves in New Japan. He was the second son, and at the age of 15, he was adopted into the Yamada clan of Kyoto, who were masters of the Sohenryu, a very old-fashioned traditional tea ceremony school, because his dad wanted him to have a profession, he can't be karo anymore. There's no sword-carrying Tokugawa, prestige that he can sort of lord about. When all of this, the frigate disaster sort of splashed into the Japanese press at that time, he read it, and he figured, okay, I think he wanted to escape from Japan. Like, maybe this will be a venture. Let me find a partner, go out into the world and let's go and do business in this unknown world of the Turks. I mean, everybody's going to New York, everybody's going to Paris, and, you know, why don't we go to this alternative world, which is in the news? He knows nothing about it, by the way. But he makes the connections. He finds a partner, a very wealthy retired naval officer, Nakamura Kenjiro, who also wants to do business. So they end up in Istanbul in 1892 with letters from Japan, from the previous, contacts of the Japanese frigates that visited Istanbul, bringing survivors. The captains wrote them reference letters, gave them names. You go to see this and that person. They introduced themselves, and they were able to establish the store under the protection of the Sultan. Now, the store itself became the hub of this transnational interaction. And he, until the end of his life, Yamada, even after he returned back to Japan, he continued to be a visible, what I call intermediary in trade and informal diplomacy until his death in 1957. He was never a high-ranking official, but he was always there. If the Turkish embassy wanted something, they would contact Yamada, who would then contact somebody appropriate in the, Gaibusho or someplace, serving as a kind of non-governmental contact point, if you will. And I really think that maybe he chose Istanbul because it's part of Asia culturally, but it also is a gateway to the world. It's a business center. And maybe he also wanted to remake himself. This is me interpreting his life from his diary. He wanted to remake himself as a new person. Yamada of Istanbul, who has Turkish friends. And that brings him some cachet back home. Because if people want contacts with the Turkish world, well, then he can sort of provide his services and help. Of course, he did business, and I think that the products of his business are also very important. Tobacco for the Japanese Imperial Army to be distributed freely to the soldiers. That came from Turkey. Opium for the Taiwan colonial government, because the colonial government, as you know, set up these clinical centers for dispensing opium and maybe controlling and monitoring opium addiction in Taiwan. So that opium came from Turkey, actually, via Yamada's store. Leather, probably leather business in Japan was not as prolific as in Turkey, because leather, all kinds of leather goods are produced probably back then. And for some reason that I don't understand, cognac. Cognac produced in the Thracian territories of the empire with their label. Maybe they were popular in Japan or whatever it was, tons of cognac exported from Istanbul. In return, imports, Japanese luxury goods, porcelain, practically most of the porcelain in the Ottoman palaces are Yamada sold, so he made money out of selling things to the Sultan's family. Lacquer and silk textiles. We've discovered letters in the family collection of, letters from the palace saying that the ladies of the harem, they'd like to look at the new catalog of silks, So Yamada is probably selling silk textiles to the women. Mineral water became very important because Istanbul kept experiencing cholera epidemic, and therefore the water was unsanitary in some neighborhoods, and therefore people preferred to drink mineral water, which is, sort of sterile and safe. So Japanese mineral water, for some reason, became very popular. And Japanese paper. This is Yamada himself. It reflects, I think, his role of this informal consul general, in Istanbul, because this photograph is in the family archives today, and behind it, he, in his own hand, he signs, he says, I have had this photograph taken on the occasion of my audience with Sultan Abdulhamid and discussions about the Russo-Japanese War. So he's reporting to the palace on what's happening. He has another photograph, which I think shows him in a different, image. He is wearing a traditional scholar's robe. This is a Danishmand robe. By the way, he's not Orientalizing, okay? When people see this photograph, they say, oh, this is Orientalism. Actually not, because this robe is actually used in the medrese, in the traditional schools. When you are an associate professor, there's a ceremony and you wear this robe, and your teacher gives you a special kind of, sort of license saying you can teach from now on the traditional, topics of education. So he is also posing with the Mecidiye order that he got from the Ottoman palace. In other words, he was decorated. The contents of the book, it's all about the Turks, the imperial capital, the palace, Ramazan, monumental buildings of Istanbul, fountains, house, theater, Turkish tobacco, and I think one of you is doing a book on the Ottoman debt. He has information on the Ottoman debt because as a businessman, he was in contact with the debt institution that was established, Umumiye. And then he reports to us saying that they have a very practical system. And this is how they pay the Ottoman debt, kind of totally economic information about how it's paid, what percentage, and the kind of, sort of like future projections about, how the debt is going to be decreased and so on and so forth. So as a businessman, I guess he thought this was important. So he included that into his book. And also what is interesting about the work is he has, in the front and the back, poems and calligraphy of high officials and notable persons who visited Turkey. So what he did was he asked the Japanese Meiji elite visitors to write a calligraphic poem or to write an essay, something about, what they felt during their visit. And I find, of course, these poems to be very fascinating because they are geopoetica. In other words, they are poetry that expresses a political imagination. And they tell a story, and they tell a sort of vision, if you will. I borrow this from Harsharam, who's doing work on Pushkin and geopoetica of Russian poetry about the Caucasus, so I'm applying it to the Japanese poetry here. Now let's look at Yamada's Asian cosmopolitanism. How does it emerge? First of all, in the text, he keeps saying, the Turks are like us. They're very similar to us. Their family life, their everyday, sort of behavior and so on. So do not think, he's telling the Japanese, do not think that they are gaijin. They're not really foreign. Yes, technically they're foreign, but they're close to us, kind of. This sort of an argument. Second, that Islam is a culture. It's a religion, but he introduces it as culture, as kind of like the way of life of people, not so much the theology and the religious teaching, but the way of life of the people, how people go to prayer, what do they do during Ramadan, and what does the sugar holiday mean when they break fast, sort of like more of a sociological and cultural phenomena. But he says, even though the religion is strict, he's very much a Meiji, reformist in his mind. He says that these strict aspects of Islam are being softened and that the seclusion of women is changing. Istanbul Muslim women and men marry late and monogamy is becoming prevalent. So he is very much in favor of the progressive 19th century. He admires the glory of the early Ottoman, empire, but it's a romantic story of the past. We don't want it now. And he says that, the Turks today are like us because we are changing too. We are also Bumme Kaika, and they're also doing Bumme Kaika, you know. They're also sort of moving on the path of, civilization and enlightenment. So, you know, we're sort of like going through the same experience. Similar cultural habits, for example, he says that the Ramadan sugar holiday is like Japanese New Year. People visit their friends. And that, you know, women like to visit the shrines of the holy Muslim sages, just like Japanese women, because this is where they pray for good marriage and children, you know, these kind of folkloric habits. And he also gives information, now that's interesting, on the Asian origins of the ancient Turks. Now, he's read his Sui and Tang dynasty sections. A colleague of mine compared his sentences with the Sui dynasty account of the Tuğ, the ancient Turks of, you know, the Altai Mountains, and she said it's practically the same sentences. So he's, you know, he's looked at the dynastic sources. These are the ancient Turks, you know. So he gives us that information. That is interesting because at that moment in time, nobody in Turkey knows this. Okay? The Japanese, they have access to the Chinese dynastic records. They are interested in the Turkic world or the, you know, bonding of, you know, with the Turks of the empire. So for them, this is already, we know at the turn of the century, Shiratori Kurakichi, for example, of Tokyo University, started studying the ancient nomads, Altaic language debates, and so on. He knows that. So he's using that information to give us all the history of the ancient Turks, verbatim from the Kambun, you know, original Chinese records. The multicultural, multi-ethnic milieu of 19th century Istanbul, he finds exciting. He thinks this is exciting because we don't have that in Japan. You know, he thinks this is sort of like a totally new world for himself. Toruko Gakan's Asianist cosmopolitanism comes out especially in 24 major elite essays and calligraphy. Bear with me. I'm going to read briefly a couple of paragraphs from Baron Sakatani Yoshiro's essay, where he argues that Turkey is an Asian power inserted into Europe, sort of like one leg in Europe, you know. And he will say, you know, I don't want to sort of like try to reopen my text, but let me paraphrase it for you. What Sakatani will say is that, you know, the Turks are the ones who control the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles. Therefore, they are controlling both immediately Asia on one side of the, you know, straits and Europe. And it's overlooking the Black Sea. This is very Japanese, you know, understanding of that region, its importance, if you will. And he says that, you know, he uses a sentence which is remarkable. He says, their government is corrupt. They are completely bogged down with debt. And the Europeans are constantly interfering in their domestic affairs. And the world, as you know, is dominated by the European imperialist powers, subjugating all the peoples of, you know, Asia. But he says, it's really a miracle that the Turks are still independent. He says, we don't understand why they're independent, but it's a miracle, despite all these horrible conditions, that they are still there, you know. So his argument is, because they're an Asian power inserted into Europe, because they've got some territories there, and they have a history with Europe, therefore we have to bond with Turkey. And he's advising the Japanese who are reading this book that you should have a kind of special attention to communicate with the people of this world and so forth. There's also calligraphy, beautiful calligraphy in the book, and also poetry, and this geopoetica is interesting because when you read these poems, you can see the shared themes. The Japanese are lamenting the decline of the Turkish Empire. They express this in poetic terms. And they're wishing it to rise from the ashes. They admire the landscape and the palaces as that of an ancient empire like ancient China. This is always an analogy. These palaces are like the ancient palaces of the Tang Dynasty, a kind of, sort of imagined metaphor. What amazes me also is that they express all these ideas not so much in uta, Japanese, poetry, but they prefer kanbun, which I think is appropriate to this imagination about, this empire looking like ancient China. So you use kanbun, which is Japanese classical Chinese, to write your poetry and your essays rather than pure Japanese poetry, for example. So I'm going to read a couple of the poems for you. This is from Odessa's, the Japanese Consul General of Odessa, at the outbreak of the Russo-Japanese War. Iijima Kametaro, who was in charge of intelligence during that period, he came to Istanbul. He organized Yamada and his partner, Nakamura, to collect information about the Russian volunteer fleet in the Black Sea and to report immediately the minute the vessels passed the Bosphorus. So that's part of the intelligence, operation. Later, by the way, he became Consul General in New York, and he's known for fighting against the law in California that prohibited the Japanese from buying agricultural land. The poem is interesting because I think it expresses so well this lamentation to the decline of the Ottoman Empire. Encountering the yellow lace flowers of autumn, grieving the declining great old state, hoping the nation will surge and arise in the shadow of the crescent moon, withered yellow autumn flowers, how they wait for the morning sun, Japan, to sparkle their dew. That's one poem. Another one from Chancellor of Keio University, later Minister of Education, as the waning moonlight vanishes away, pulling nets along the Golden Horn shore. And finally, this is by an Asianist, Sasa Tomofusa, who was very close to Toyama Mitsuru, the spiritual head of the Black Dragon Society. And in his poem, he says, he met Osman Pasha, who was a hero in 1877 because he fought against the Russians, and the international press sort of like really turned him into a kind of international hero at that time. And he says, I left a verse, the horseshoes of the bravest hero of all time, crushed through the clouds of Russia, his white beard like snow, 70 years old, unchanged, vigorous, the old commander. So this is a kind of, admiration to this military hero whom he met. So these poems are fantastic because they truly present this imagination about the Turks and their Turkish world as part of this Asian, cosmopolitan, but also as a sort of like political desire. I hope they revive themselves again. I hope they come back to the stage of the earth again. The book is illustrated by a Japanese artist who used the photographs of Yamada in Tokyo. And every page has beautiful compositions. This is the Golden Horn and the Bridge, organized in a very Japanese aesthetic. The compositions are very Japanese in their aesthetic. Some of these illustrations are Yamada's personal sketches, like, for example, these are the portraits of people strolling along the Golden Horn Bridge. And he writes here in this text, he says, you can see people from thousands of nations if you just go on the Galata Bridge in the Golden Horn. All kinds of figures, as you can see, a European, even a donkey, a European lady, probably somebody from, Central Asia, a Tatar, a Greek priest, all kinds of figures of Istanbul at that time. Some of the sketches are his own. This one probably is his own, we think, about, the Genoese Galata Tower and the harbor and the boatmen at the Golden Horn. Now, I've come to my final comment. That's all fine. Asian cosmopolitanism, and also camaraderie, we're bonding, we're brothers, this and that. But then there's another turn of the century third pattern, and that's just the emergence of the Japanese army, especially military geopolitical interest in Turkey and the Turkish world as an entry into the world of Islam. That's beyond, the Ottoman Empire itself. And the mastermind is General Utsunomiya Taro. He was in charge of intelligence in the general staff, Section 2, and he's the one who funded Sun Yat-sen and Kang Yu-wei. It comes from his purse. He and the colonel in charge of Asian intelligence in the general staff, Fukushima Yasumasa, he's a very famous figure. It's their secret, budget for intelligence activity. And he's the one who's funding Muslim activists, bringing them to Tokyo. Most of them from India, they are running from the British authorities because they're very active in anti-British activism. Also, Muslims who are engaged, especially from Russia. The famous Kadı, the Tatar intellectual, religious man, journalist, Abdurrashid Ibrahim, who's very important in this transnational for the military, okay? It's a separate parallel process. A captain from Egypt who escaped from Egypt. He didn't like the British. His name is Ahmet Fazlı, and he's received political asylum in Tokyo. So all these activists in diaspora revolutionary and anti-British or anti-Russian activism, the Japanese military is gathering them in Tokyo, and therefore they're embarking now on a new policy of collaborating with these people, well, against who? Against Russia, against Britain, come what may. Now, Utsunomiya's diary has been published, fortunately. It's a great source. It came out in 2007. And in his diary, he says this. I love the general. He's very honest. He's your typical military man who says, that's it, to the point, what he's thinking. Not like a politician who sometimes might, cover it up with some sort of, euphemistic illusions, and you don't understand what the real motive is. He says, we need these people. We need Abdurrashid Ibrahim. We need Captain Ahmad Fazlı of Egypt and the Pan-Islamist socialist Barakatullah of India as necessary in the future conflict with Christian powers. I found it very interesting that he had this religious, metaphor in his mind, because no Japanese publicly would say at that moment, we are in contestation with Christian powers. It's very medieval almost, sort of like a crusade. But he's thinking that, you see? He is thinking that. He says we need the Muslim activists against the Christian powers because we're going to make use of, unfortunately, it's the beginning of what I would call political stereotyping of Islam as a kind of, constantly conflictual and constantly, violent religion that has been fighting Christianity forever. Sort of like, it's one of those stereotypes of Islamophobia which became very dominant in the 20th century. I need not to go into the details of that. But he has that notion. And he says they will fight very well against the Christian powers because of historic reasons. So we'll use them at the forefront. So that's pretty, you know, when you read that, you say, uh-oh, this is a different world that's coming up, you know. And in 1908, he did send Ahmet Fazlı without telling the foreign ministry, on his own. He writes this in his diary. He says, the foreign ministry is stupid. They keep asking the Turks extraterritoriality. Why do we need extraterritoriality? Let's just dump it. You know, it's outdated. Anyway, the Europeans are the ones imposing it. So let's offer a treaty to the Turks saying, no extraterritoriality, none of these, you know, binding terms, on equal terms, Japan and Turkey, and then we'll move on. Now, it fails, okay, this visit. But he's thinking that. And then he will also fund Ibrahim's return back to Istanbul in 1909, 1910. Ibrahim visits Tokyo. He is introduced to the Black Dragons, that's his network, and also to the Russia branch of the Imperial Army, right? And they form a, you know, association. They call it Ajegikai. It's going to be the association to publicize Japan's support and friendship to Muslims of the world. It's a kind of like a sort of civil association, but members are usually army officers and activists like this. In 1910, Ibrahim accompanied this first Japanese Muslim, Omar Yamaoka Kotaro, who was former Harbin intelligence field agent, to visit Mecca and Medina. In Islamic discourse, even today, he is seen as the hallowed first Japanese Muslim who performed his pilgrimage properly as a pious believer to Mecca and Medina. He was on a political mission in reality. And during that visit, they met with Arab notables, they spoke about contemporary affairs, and then finally in Istanbul, Omar Yamaoka, as this Japanese person, young man, introduced himself, gave public lectures to Russia Muslim Tatar students studying in Istanbul. This is his official photograph, and this is Ibrahim. Now, what does it all mean? When they came to Istanbul, they never came to Nakamura's store. The Nakamura store is the hub of any Japanese who visits Istanbul ever since 1892. Anybody who comes to Istanbul, they have the address in their hand. Utsunomiya's people, both Japanese and Japanese collaborators, they avoid Nakamura. They don't go to the store. They don't meet with the Japanese there because they want a different network. They only stay in the traditional Muslim quarters of the old city, and they are in contact with the Tatar students from Russia because they speak to them in Russian. When Yamaoka gave his lecture in Istanbul, he gave it in Russian, and Ibrahim translated it into Turkish. In other words, what we see here is the two patterns are competing. They're separate, and it's the beginning, in my opinion. Maybe Utsunomiya wouldn't have dared this. He wouldn't have dared saying, I'm going to topple, you know, the civilian government or something. This is too early. He's not a man like that. He was the military attaché in London negotiating for the Anglo-Japanese alliance, you know. But two patterns. The cosmopolitan pattern, where you know, collaborate with the people, with the government, this and that, and say, we're all part of the Asian camaraderie, or the Pan-Asianist political pattern, where you choose a different network, and you avoid the network of the foreign ministry, the civilian government. It's a separate network. So, my remarks, I guess, would be that they didn't contact each other. So Japanese policy to this day, I see this. It's very interesting. It carries two parallel but sometimes conflictual interests and separate networks with occasional convergence, but with separation. Separation, in other words, the more familiar, government to government, public to public, people to people. But then you also have a strategic parallel operation of only associating with, certain circles. And it would tend to be the Islamic circles. And your intention there is not just, local people in Istanbul or somewhere in Turkey, but beyond. It's connected to Japan's face that it wants to show in the Muslim world. That's different. So these two parallel processes, we know that the Utsunomiya version is going to surface in the 1930s and 40s. It's going to be major to the Asian internationalism of the period, and big propaganda networks will be sent to Southeast Asia, to China. Kelly Hammond, she published recently a book about this. I'm sure you must have, become familiar with it, Hammond's book. And, it will be a major strategy, okay, of global Islam, kind of connect with it against China, against Russia, against Britain, against, the Dutch in Southeast Asia, whatever. In other words, we see the origins of this in this game in Istanbul already at the turn of the century, is what I'm saying. Well, thank you very much for your patience.